Welcome back, everyone, to another wonderful individual and society lecture. We're going to be picking up where we left off in chapter 5, where we had just gone over the basic outline of what status characteristics theory is. So the 30-second summation before we resume where we left off. We have this theory within group processes and structure, a face of sociological social psychology. This general theoretical framework says that people form expectations of others in terms of how competent someone will be in a task-based group, and that this perceived competency, this expectation, is in part formed by and in turn forms status structures. These status structures within task groups are hierarchical rankings in terms of who you think will offer more or less towards achieving the group's goal. These status structures emerge relatively quickly, and once they emerge, they start shaping how people behave, and normally that occurs in such a way that it reinforces the initially emerged status structure. And then finally, we were talking about the idea of structure, or not finally, but one of the final points was we talked about structures as self-fulfilling prophecies, to where an individual tends to already be ranked highly. They're given more opportunities to act in a given way. Those actions are evaluated more favorably, and so that person ends up, in actuality, being the highest status member of the group. And so the final point that we left on, the point that I wanted to make sure that we were emphasizing, is the idea that within expectation states theory, we have status characteristics theory. Status characteristics theory is what says that of all the things that can be shaping your expectation for competency within a group, one of the main things that shapes this is something known as status characteristics. So status characteristics shape how we view other people. These status characteristics are normally our way of chunking information, looking for indicators of that chunked information. And the final point that I was covering is that of these status characteristics, we have specific status characteristics, which refer to attributes or abilities that are only relevant in certain situations. So a specific status characteristic would be some sort of indicator that you have math or artistic ability. Then we also have what's called diffuse status characteristics, which refer to attributes such as gender, race, ethnicity, or class, which shape others' expectations across social contexts. That's the diffuse status characteristics that we'll largely be focusing on moving forward, because these are of interest because, one, they tend to be activated across situational contexts, and two, you don't really have much of a choice in whether they are activated in a situation because you can't really hide a diffuse status characteristic. And then finally, of note, diffuse status characteristics are often tied to broad cultural notions about group competencies, which then becomes associated with expected individual level competencies. So here's a bias. Like as a society, we tend to view individuals who are of an Asian ethnicity, race ethnicity, as being better at math. And so any individual that we then associate as being a part of that group, we will likewise assume that they are more competent in a task that involves math or science in some fashion. Is this based on reality? Not necessarily, like not really. There's a lot of overgeneralization and a lot of false information, but the point is that we're acting upon our internalized expectations and understandings of groups that we learn through socialization throughout our lives. So let's move now on to the new content. So within status characteristics theory, we have a couple of other key concepts such as status beliefs and status generalization. So what are status beliefs? Status beliefs refer to a set of assumptions about a particular group within society relative to another. It's the idea that status inherently implies a hierarchical ranking along some sort of dimension. And since it's hierarchical, that means there must be at least two groups that are being ranked hierarchically. So status beliefs refer to a set of assumptions and thereby assumed behavioral expectations regarding a group relative to another group. And within these groups are nested individuals. So status beliefs are the hierarchical component of cultural stereotypes, beliefs that one group or status is better, smarter, more sophisticated, and more competent than another. So we have the classic example of men being perceived at being better at math than women for a variety of reasons. This is the perception. And once that perception became more crystallized and began reproducing itself across generations, it became a element of status characteristics and status beliefs. So status beliefs tend to associate the dominant group in society with active goal-directed behaviors. If you're wondering which group is likely to be considered the high status group within the specific hierarchical ranking along a specific dimension, the answer is, well, which group tends to be assumed to be more agentic, which group is said to be more behavior goal driven in their actions. Whichever group that seems to be more strongly associated with, that tends to be the high status group in a society. And normally, if you're a high status group, you also have greater access to resources for a variety of reasons, including the operation of status beliefs within task-oriented groups. You're more likely to be able to accumulate resources if within a series of tasks over time, you're viewed as more competent than others, in part because of your status characteristic, which then in turn lets you successfully act out a role within these task groups. And then this just reinforces to everyone observing that you're competent. And so it makes it much more likely that you're going to then be able to accumulate resources over time. So those are beliefs. What's status generalization then? It's important to note that diffuse status characteristics, so these statuses that are normally tied to some sort or are associated, socially associated with some sort of physical indicator that you can't really hide when you come into an interaction. And these groups are associated with large society spanning axes of stratification. So diffuse status characteristics influence group interactions, even when they're not immediately relevant to the task at hand. So remember earlier when I was saying, like, if we were in a group in an economics class and I say that I had taken an advanced economics seminar, that information now becomes relevant. Like that will influence my placement in the status hierarchy. If we're in a group of musicians and we're tasked with composing like a brief song, that bit of information, my placement within a group of economists is not really going to impact my status within the group, or at least not very much. Even whenever the task is not directly associated with a large society spanning group that forms the basis of a diffuse status characteristic, even when that is not immediately relevant to the task at hand, those assumed competencies and rankings are still going to come into play. So the idea is in a gender neutral task, like something that's considered, if you were to survey 1,000 people, both sides are like, this is neither male nor female, neither men nor women are better at this task. In an actual small task oriented group, all else being equal, men will be perceived as more competent at that task at the outset of the group coming together. And as we know, that initial status hierarchy is quickly reinforced and legitimated because you start operating on the initial status hierarchy when a group comes together. And then that shapes who talks, how people behave, how they respond to others, and then it just keeps the snowball going. So these diffuse status characteristics that you can't hide, you can't really hide, you can't necessarily stop someone from considering them by making it invisible to them. become relevant in the formation of status hierarchies, even whenever the task is not necessarily tied to some society spanning assumption of task specific competencies within these groups. The task is neither male nor female, neither men nor women are better at it than another. So how does this tie to status generalization? Status generalization is the process through which diffuse status characteristics are associated first with task relevant abilities, and then as a result, individual performance expectations and subsequent behaviors within groups. So it's the idea that I see that you are a member of a high status society spanning group that is associated with unequal access to resources and power. As soon as I recognize that, I'm going to assume that not only are you competent in some specific things that maybe that group is associated with, like, you're upper class, you're probably really good at business because business is something that is directly associated with the upper class. But I'm going to assume that you're probably just better at everything. You're high status, at least in one dimension. And so I'm just going to, barring any other like very specific information to the task at hand, I'm just going to assume that that high status doesn't just apply to one aspect of your life, but it probably impacts you as an overall person. So if you have a collection of high status characteristics, unless the task is specifically framed in a way that's counter to meanings associated with your group, the more of these high statuses you have, the more likely you're going to be taken seriously in the group, the more likely you're going to be viewed as high status, the more opportunities you're going to have to interact, and the more favorably you're going to be evaluated for your actions. So status generalization is taking this association of task relevant abilities with a group and then assuming that that applies to a larger variety of situations for all individuals who are members of that high status group. So this is why if you go into a task-based group and you're a white man, you have two high status characteristics because in society spanning groups of stratification, men tend to have more power, more resources, and are viewed as more agentic and goal directed than women are. And the same thing is generally we find in terms of perceptual data we get, people perceive the same sort of trends regarding white men compared to non-white men, particularly black men. So by having both white and male status going into any group based task that is not specifically tied to the assumed competencies of women or non-white individuals, you're just going to be taken seriously the most. So let's just go with how to start a campfire, right? Like realistically, everyone can start a campfire, but it's going to be assumed without anyone realizing it. They're going to assume that the white male in the group compared to other individuals who might not share those high status characteristics is going to be the one who's most able to achieve the group's outcome of actually lighting the fire. Okay, so a little bit more on diffuse status characteristics. Researchers have studied the status generalization process by manipulating the relative status of members in task-oriented groups. So since we're studying task-oriented groups, and we've identified a single thing that we think holding all else equal will cause a difference in outcome, this really lends itself to laboratory experiments, right? You're basically setting things up to where it's here's the task, here is the composition of the groups, here's the outcome, whether it be the actual performance of the group or how people view others in the group or the behaviors undertaken by the group. If everything is equal except the composition of the groups in regards to a single status characteristic, then that status characteristic must be the causal mechanism causing the difference between the groups. So what have we found when researching status characteristics, diffuse status characteristics specifically? Researchers have found empirically that diffuse status characteristics, we have empirical evidence that in these situations, right? All else being equal, being a man, being white, and being upper class nets you higher status in a task-oriented group. Like, that's empirical data within laboratory tests. You can always get back to the argument, right, of critiquing these that they don't have great external validity, that you can't really generalize them because the laboratory situation is so controlled. But the point of the laboratory experiment isn't necessarily to discount all other factors that might be impacting actual behaviors in the real world. It's to say that we have been able to determine that even with all of those other things going on, this mechanism does exist. And so it must be accounted for. So, reading directly from the slide now, researchers have found that diffuse status characteristics, gender, race, ethnicity, class, significantly affect group members' performance expectations, evaluations, and task-relevant behaviors. A couple of subpoints. One, this is pretty much always happening at the unconscious level. You're very rarely aware of the fact you're doing this. The whole point of why this operates, we think, is to help you quickly sort through information, get on with the interaction. You don't have unlimited time to spend in interaction parsing through information. So these are just shortcuts that you develop in your head. The problem, of course, being from a sociological standpoint, that these shortcuts tend to end up reifying existing inequalities, because inequalities are sneaky and they have an actual structuring impact on how interactions even come together. But it's not like this is a conscious thought of, I'm consciously thinking, he is male, therefore he is better at this task relative to this woman who is talking or wanting to talk in the task group. It happens that quick because interactions unfold in a relatively small span of time when you get right down to it, like less than seconds sometimes. The other thing is, in order for a status characteristic, diffuse or otherwise, to have an impact on the interaction, have an impact on the unfolding of that task-based group, the characteristic has to be considered salient. So it has to at least register in the mind of others in the room as a thing, right? It has to be something that you see on someone else and recognize that there's a gender there. And then things take over to where, all right, I have this encoded set of socialized meanings and expectations associated with this gender. And now, based upon that, I'm starting to form initial status assumptions about this person. But if for some reason, like, that characteristic isn't made visible, then it doesn't come into play. The problem is that for most diffuse status characteristics, it's almost impossible to stop those characteristics from becoming salient. So that's what I say whenever you can't hide them. What I mean is you have a very difficult time stopping them from becoming salient in the situation. So the example the book gives, for example, gender translates into more positive performance expectations that for males than for females in mixed sex groups. This doesn't occur in single sex groups. Why? Because there's no one else to compare the males to in that single sex group. So that's one of the only ways to stop a characteristic if it's diffuse from coming into play is for everyone else in the group to share that characteristic, because then it just sort of nulls out. Everyone is assumed to have the same status, so we're not really even considering that specific characteristic because everyone has it. Is the most commonly found result. There is some theoretical argument regarding whether it is a little bit more complicated than that. Final point the book wants to point out regarding diffuse status characteristics is that the nature of the group task matters. So this is getting to where I was talking about all else being equal in the task, right? If we really want to identify like how impactful holding a status is, independent of the task itself, we have to at least measure how those tasks are typically viewed by people in terms of being associated with one group or another. So, for example, the effect of gender as a diffuse status characteristic on a task in a task-oriented group varies depending on whether the task is female, in like stereotypically female, stereotypically male, or gender neutral. So the idea is the status advantage that men would have in the mixed gender group of change oil and car would be amplified both because they hold the status male, which would just generally come into play, or whether, sorry, as well as the fact that men are associated with things like mechanics. So he gets a double boost there, just the possession of the diffuse characteristic and the association of the task with the diffuse characteristic. So we'll call this, for men, we'll call this +2 on the status hierarchy. Now, consider the case to where the task is gender neutral. You know, surveys find that people consider gardening a gender neutral task. In that case, all else being equal in the mixed sex group, men would get a +1 to their initial placement in the status hierarchy, because even though male hasn't been associated with gardening, right, it still ends up giving him a boost because of this assumption that, well, male is high status, so even if it's not associated with this task, we can just assume that we do mentally assume that, okay, they're still probably relatively competent at this task. Whenever we look at the opposite end, so a task that is gendered, but it's associated with the typically lower status group being more competent, in that case, we would say that females would get a +1 to their initial placement in the status hierarchy, because while they do possess the female status characteristic, and that female status characteristic is associated with this task because this task is thought of as female, and so that gives them a +1 to their status hierarchy, they still possess the general diffuse status characteristic of female, which generally is associated with being lower in status than male. So instead of getting the +2, they're only getting +1 to the initial status hierarchy. That is a rough approximation, okay? Like, this is a simplification of things just to make the comparison of effects easier. It's way more nuanced than this. This is where you have to, you know, read a number of the articles directly to get the nuance. So one additional thing, now that we've talked about this idea of diffuse status characteristics, I mentioned it a little bit ago, this idea that you can possess multiple diffuse status characteristics. So as the book highlights, people form performance expectations based on multiple statuses by combining information about an individual's diffuse and specific status characteristics. Quote, Berger et al., 1997. So information about positive status characteristics and information about negative status characteristics can be combined to yield two distinct subsets. The two subsets are then averaged to yield an overall performance expectation, right? So male, which is considered to be a higher status than female in general societal perceptions and access to resources, and then black, which would be considered lower in status characteristics due to due to society spanning perceptions of that group as being less agentic, less goal oriented, having fewer resources, and having less competencies than the white group. Now you have two diffuse status characteristics, one high and one low, and these then combine to form an overall performance expectation. So as this occurs, individual status characteristics are weighted in accordance to its perceived task relevance, and those that are most relevant exert the strongest influence. So is the task gendered? Is the task racialized? For a black man, if the task is racialized, he would not get the same status hierarchy boost as he would if the task was gendered in the favor of men. Another point is that information that is consistent with other information about an individual is given less weight than information that runs counter to what people already know. This is basically, there's diminishing marginal returns at a certain point for having multiple advantage statuses. So if I have 4 advantage statuses, it's not a cumulative +1, +1, +1, +1. It would be something like +1, +0.8, +0.4, +0.2. Because each piece of information, as it just continues to verify what I already was assuming based upon other status characteristics, weighs less in my mind. So then if I have, let's say the formula is actually 3 high and 1 low status characteristic. Let's say the formula goes +1 for first high status, +0.5 for second high status, +0.2 for third high status, and then I get to the low status, which is just a -1. So at that point, we had 1, 1.5, 1.7, -1. We would have a 0.9 increase in status. That addition of that final diffuse status characteristic wiped out all the advantage of status high status 2 and 3 and some of the advantage given to me by high status 1. Information that contradicts other information is weighted more heavily in the mind of individuals when formulating initial performance expectations. This is very mathematical in my mind because in order to test these things, we use complex mathematical equations to compute the effects of multiple status characteristics on performance expectations. And again, we can do this because we can put people into a variety of laboratory settings, control down to only allow a few things to vary. And because we know exactly what we're allowing to vary, and we have an understanding of how we can measure this, we can make our mathematical models very complex, which you have to have if you're trying to look at multiple simultaneous effects and still be able to parse out what is causing what. All right, so here's a quick visualization of how status characteristics theory kind of thinks about things, right? We have status beliefs, which occur at the macro level. These shape performance expectations. At the highest level of the micro level, these performance expectations then shape actual behavior, which is task-related behaviors. These task-related behaviors then influence how people evaluate others in the group. They see what the group has done, and then they evaluate everyone's competencies again. But because of the existing status hierarchy in the group, those who are high status are more likely to be viewed more favorably than other members. And so in this way, performance evaluations then reinforce status beliefs at the macro level. They also reinforce performance expectations within that task group and thereby end up causing task-related behaviors to continue to be shaped by this status hierarchy. So if this is how we imagine society-spanning systems of inequality and stratification along groups impacting behaviors at the micro level, what can be done to influence or interfere with this causal relationship? So SCT offers relatively concrete strategies for intervention into this process. Specific status characteristics can be introduced into social institutions to counter the effect of a diffuse status characteristic. So if you have a diffuse status characteristic that would cause you to be penalized in, say, a mathematics course, say you are female, and you're more likely to be penalized in class-based activities in a math class because of that, the university can introduce specific specific status characteristics in order to counter these negative perceptions of a diffuse status characteristic. Now, with that said, it's difficult to eliminate the influence of a diffuse status characteristic. You can counter it, right? There are a number of ways to counter it, but it's very difficult to entirely eliminate the influence of these diffuse status characteristics. So, for example, Pug and Warham in '83 experimented And they found that if group members can be shown that women will outperform men on a related task, the effect of gender on susceptibility to influence can be reduced. It wasn't eliminated, but through a specific set of interventions that cause people to start associating being female with being competent on a related task, we can then end up reducing the effect of gender as a diffuse status characteristic. Now, tasks that are complex and require a variety of different abilities exhibit a characteristic called incompatible complexity. Such tasks counteract the status generalization process. So let's give an example. If a task is complex and requires distinct abilities that overlap, it's unlikely that any one individual will have all the abilities necessary to successfully complete it. This inhibits the perception that some individuals will be good at it and some individuals will be bad at it. As you can imagine, though, efficiency typically dictates that we divvy up complex tasks into simplified, smaller tasks. And so it is hard sometimes to make the most use out of incompatible complexity because we tend to favor the forming of small, very specific tasks or task ordered groups. But in those cases where we can have the task be something complex that isn't simple, that is perceived as requiring multiple skill sets, then the effect of diffuse status characteristics is significantly reduced. So that's everything I have to say about the first major theoretical frame within group processes and structure. So without any further ado, let's continue on and talk about social exchange theory, which is focused a little bit more on this idea of networks and the relationships individuals have in a mathematical sense, like who has contact with who and in what context, rather than necessarily the statuses and the meanings associated with these statuses and how they impact behavior in small groups. So we're moving from status characteristics theory, which is more group focused, to social exchange theory, which is more network focused. It's a little bit counter to what the book's about to say, which is social exchange theory focuses on patterns of interaction within both primary and secondary groups. So within both intimacy and task groups. How does that mesh with what I just said about it being more focused on networks? It's focused on the fact that within and across these groups, people can be connected. And so it's focused on the properties of connection. Anyway, I'm just going to continue on. So social exchange theory, it's focusing on patterns of interaction between collectives of people. This theory tends to focus on power, which is the degree to which a person is able to impose their will on another. Power in a sociological and a social psychological sense is the ability to make your will manifest in reality, even in the face of opposing wills. So social exchange theory is focusing on what causes one person to have more power and more able to make their will manifest in an interaction or in a collectivity of people relative to others in that collective. So social exchange theorists argue that power is exercised through the administration of reinforcement and through punishment. So we're getting into a little bit of behaviorism here, but also this idea that humans typically engage in behaviors in what can be thought of as a rational fashion in terms of evaluating cost and reward, or here, reward and risk of punishment. Important to specify in the context of social exchange theory that rewards are positive consequences of behavior or positive consequences of compliance, such as social acceptance, money, promotion, love, etc. And within this, we have the idea of a non-coercive reward or non-coercive reward power, which is exercised when an actor produces changes in another's behavior through the control of rewards. So power is considered non-coercive if Your exercising of power through administering rewards causes others to do what you want them to do, or causes them to do something other than they would. If I can use my ability to regulate your access to resources in a way that I'm giving you more resources in order to cause you to have your behavior change, that would be considered non-coercive power in the context of social exchange theory. This is counter to the idea of coercive punishment, which is where you use punishments, you use your power to administer punishment to another person in order to produce a change in their behavior. So punishment in this context is a negative outcome. This is something like being fined, being fired, being disliked, being broken up with. All of these things have perceived costs that the individual wants to avoid. Rewards are things that individuals want to actually have. Punishments are things that people want to avoid. Their whole focus of want when it comes to punishment is avoiding those things. So having something taken away would be a punishment, but not receiving a reward might not necessarily be considered a punishment. There's a little bit of overlap there. So we've talked about power. It's your ability to make your will manifest even in the face of an opposing will. And we know that people exercise power through the administration of rewards and punishments. So your ability to make your will manifest is connected to your ability to distribute rewards or your ability to distribute punishment. So within this idea of power, let's talk about power dependence relationships. For social exchange theorists, power is a property of the social relationship. Power is not really a property of the individual or the individual's placement in a group. Rather, it is about the properties of the connection between those actors in a system. So imagine I have a line between two people. Power does not reside in either of those two people. And power does not rely in the groups that we drew these people from. Power relies on the property of the actual connection itself. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the structure of groups or, collectivities. So I guess it is fair to say that to a degree, damn it, to a degree, social exchange theory is group-based because it is very good at explaining behavior in task-oriented groups. Anyway, before I continue on more discussions of whether it's more focused on networks or groups, let's return to the focus of power dependence. So power is a property of the social relationship, the tie, rather than the individual or the group of individuals. So in a power dependence relationship, boss to employee, salesman and consumer, actors' abilities to secure desired rewards from other sources serve as the base for structural power. So who has more power in the boss-employee relationship? It depends on how easily the other person can replace that tie. So if I'm at McDonald's, if I'm working at McDonald's and I know it's going to take my boss at least a week to get someone to replace me, and I know I can go across the street to Burger King, then I could be said to have more power in that relationship, in that my boss will be more likely to yield to me slacking off because they know I could walk away from this faster. I could replace them faster than they could replace me to a degree or with less cost. Same sort of thing kind of is the case with most. Now, sorry, for the boss employee relationship, that flips the more high value the job is, up to a point, because it's assumed, you're going to have trouble replacing this job. You have a decent thing here. You don't really want to roll the dice. Whereas the boss of a valued job, everyone wants to work here, so I could quickly replace you. The other example the book gave is salesman and consumer. The idea is, in most sales situations, you as the consumer have more exchange power because you can just go to a rival salesperson. This power imbalance shifts though if you go to a salesman and you find they're the only salesman you could feasibly go to. So this is the only car mechanic within 500 miles. Now you can't effectively replace them, and they have a lot more power in the relationship. However, if you go to a mechanic and there's a rival mechanic right across the street, like, they have much less power in that interaction because you can easily replace them. You can easily secure a new source of reward. So, summarizing again, in power dependence relationships, actors' ability to secure desired rewards from other sources serve as the structural basis for power. So structurally based power reflects two factors: what an actor has to offer in terms of resources, rewards, and the number of potential exchange partners who can provide the resources the actor is seeking. It's not just the degree of resources or rewards I, as one node in this collectivity, can offer you. It's your ability to access alternative nodes that could provide you with that reward. So a couple other points just to highlight is: one, the power exerted in a power dependence relation may not equal the amount of structurally based power that one actor actually has over another. So in that boss employee situation, this wasn't to say that the boss still doesn't have power over the McDonald's employee. It's saying that that power they have is less than it would be if the situation where the job was more highly valued, you know. And the potential pool of jobs at that level of value was lower. It doesn't mean that the boss doesn't have power over the employee, because they can still fire them at the drop of the hat. They can still choose not to negotiate with the employee whenever it comes to things like don't be on your phone in between, putting sandwiches together. Another point just introduces this idea that the use of power embedded in a social structure can be viewed as legitimate, which is appropriate, or illegitimate, inappropriate. That's all we really need to get into with this. It's just an acknowledgement that the exertion of power isn't always considered to be legitimate, and whether it is legitimate or not has an impact on the interaction negotiation. But not enough to really get into much more nuance here. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the types of power dependence relations. There's basically two types. You'll find that this is something we do in social psych and a lot of different theories, right? Is we boil things down to ideal typologies because it allows for a comparison of key characteristics. So there are generally considered to be two types of power dependence relationships. You have balanced and unbalanced. Probably pretty simple, right? Like, in a balanced relationship, the parties in the exchange have equal power. In an unbalanced relationship, one actor has more power than the other due to the possession of valued rewards and other exchange options. So if I need A from you and you need B from me, and neither one of us has more power to give the person what they want than the other, and there's no other alternatives, everything is basically equal, we're in a balanced power relationship. Neither one of us has a negotiating leg up on the other one. Stats exchange exchange theory really is focused on this idea of negotiation or bargaining, right? Without it being formal bargaining. So if no one has a leg up in negotiations, it's a balanced power relation. In an unbalanced power relation, one side has the leg up in negotiation because they either have a greater access to valued rewards and or based upon the number of available alternatives for them in the overall collectivity. So what does this look like in actual exchange relation? What are some dynamics in an unbalanced exchange relation? In general, the actor with the power disadvantage in an unbalanced relation is more likely to initiate the exchange. If you're the person with more power, you don't have to incur some of the penalties that stem from initiating the exchange. You can wait for someone else to come to you and initiate the exchange within reason. Because you have more power, you likely either have a more valued resource or you have a greater access to possible alternative interaction partners. So, unbalanced relationship, if you're low power, you're likely to initiate an exchange. When an unbalanced relationship persists over time, the exchange outcomes, the rewards received, tend to increasingly favor the less dependent partner, the person with more power. So, over repeated interactions where both parties have an understanding of, even at a subconscious level, their relative power, the person with more power will extract more and more favorable terms. They'll basically force a renegotiation of the exchange conditions each time up to a certain point. And each time they force a renegotiation, they're basically saying, hey, just like last time, you have nowhere to go. And in fact, by trading with me last time in whatever social exchange we engaged in, you have less experience trading with a different partner in the overall collectivity, if one exists. So we both know that you kind of have to do this within reason. And so instead of an even 1-to-1 ratio or even the 1-to-5-to-1 ratio of resource exchange, I'm going to up it to a 1.6-to-1 ratio because I can and because we've both proven that you need this more than I do. And so also, final point, the reward the less dependent partner receives will increase until they reach the level at which the disadvantaged actor could obtain the same reward from an alternative exchange partner. This really kind of gets down to economic thinking to a degree. Basically, if I'm the more powerful person in an exchange, every time you come back to me, I'm going to just keep asking more until finally you get to the point to where my revised negotiation demand is more socially costly than a possible alternative you could go to. And at that point, I would stop trying to increase the amount of reward I got in the interaction. So just like with monopolies, right, in the economic sphere, if there's no one else for you to socially trade with, I can just keep increasing this social cost to crazy high proportions in any exchange. So I keep saying exchange, even though we've largely just been talking about power. Let's connect this idea of power and exchange and talk about power and exchange networks. So exchange relations often occur within the context of power exchange networks. This is largely why I was thinking of social exchange theory being more network based. And it's because there are different nodes within the collectivity you can access that might not necessarily form a group, but they still matter for the exchange of power and the power of the relative level of power in an exchange for each party. So, reiterating, exchange relations often occur within the context of a power exchange network. What is an exchange network? Exchange networks consist of two or more interconnected exchange relations. For there to be an exchange network, you have to have two or more interconnected exchange relations. And exchange relations, each involving a power dependence relation, become connected when exchange in one relation affects the nature of an exchange in the other. So if I just have a group of two people, if I just have A and B, and A and B have to go ahead and exchange with each other for some reason, that's not an exchange network because it doesn't have two or more relations. Now, if I have a relationship between A and B and possibly A and C, those two exchange relations are connected through the person known as A. A can trade with B or A can trade with C. And because of that, the power in one of those relationships will affect the power dynamic in the other. So with this broad sort of understanding, there's going to be an image on the next slide to help visualize this. But within this idea of an exchange network, a negatively connected exchange network is one where the exchange in one relation reduces the exchange in another, e.g., picking a partner for a class group project. Right? The exchange in one relation, if you have an exchange in one relation, it means you will be exchanging less, if anything, in another exchange relation. This brings up the idea of opportunity costs. So opportunity costs reflect the potential rewards that are lost when you choose one exchange partner over the other. In negatively connected exchange networks, if you're A and you choose to trade with B, you will have less trading going on with C. The trade you lose out between yourself and person C is your opportunity cost, the rewards that you forego by choosing the course of action that you do. So a negatively connected network structure can be unbalanced or balanced, right? Going back to the idea of you either have equal power, equal exchange, or unequal power in exchange. Both of these can come into play in a network structure. So here's our visualization, all right? We have total number of points available, 24. In low value exchanges, you can exchange 8 resources. So as we look at the networks displayed here, because there's a fundamental difference, right, in how many resources you can exchange through these lines. So take a look at the figure to the left. We see a resource exchange connection of 24, 24, and 24 between A and each B partner. So if B chooses to trade with A, so look at the B at the very bottom of the triangle on the left-hand side. If B down there chooses to trade with either of the other Bs instead of A, that person B at the bottom will forego the equivalent of 16 points of exchange because they traded with one of the Bs using an 8-point system, an 8-point connection rather than trading with A. Now, here's the thing to kind of consider in this. All right. A note in the figure on the left, A knows that it is connected to all 3 of these Bs, 24, 24, 24. And it knows that B can either, all 3 of those Bs can either trade with it or they can trade with each other. But if they trade with each other, they don't do as well off. In that case, A can kind of negotiate with any B that wants to trade with it. And that's why its exchange value is the way it is. It basically looks at B and says, hey, listen, you know that if you trade with B, you'll get an exchange rate of 8. You'll get an exchange rate of 8. How about instead we cut a deal to where you can connect with me, we'll have a more valuable exchange, but I'm going to give you less resources. I'm going to force you to give me more points than I give you back. I'll still give you points, better than the deal you would get if you exchange with one of the other Bs in the network, but it's not going to be an equitable distribution. I'd actually have to pull the study here to talk to you in more depth about how these values were determined. But this is supposed to be the visualization of an unbalanced exchange network. If you're in a situation to where certain actors, whenever they trade with other actors, have fewer access to rewards, the person in the network who has most control over the most valued rewards has the most power in dictating terms. We don't see this in the balanced network off to the right. I might make like a short standalone video just talking about this study because it's a very interesting study. But yeah, all right. Let's talk about what the book has to say about a negotiated exchange. So this is drawing upon the figure we just looked at, 5.3. So what are negotiated exchanges? A negotiated exchange is one in which actors bargain over resources. So you have something I want, I have something you want, other people in the system have something either I want, you want, or we both want. And based upon the relative amount of power in that network, that will determine the exchange rate. Remember here, power is not determined by the group that you're in, and it's not determined by any property of you, the individual. It's determined by the structure of the total relationships within the network, the total pools of resources, and the alternative pools of resources. So how many resources are in each pool and how many distinct pools of resources exist. So figure 5.3 draws from a Cook and Emerson study in 78, and here's what they found. The use of power was substantially greater among occupants of position A in an unbalanced network than position C in the balanced network. This is due to the structure of the network. So let's go back here. In this exchange network, on the left, there are 3 paths to where you can do a 24 unit exchange, which is good, and 3 paths where you can do an 8 unit exchange, which is not as good. Over here, we still have 4 people, but the connections are defined to where any exchange route is of the same resource exchange. In this case, the person who's located at the center of the triangle on the left still has more power than the person located in the middle on the right. Even though, as you see, like here's A has a connection of 24, 24, 24, and C also has a connection of 24, 24, 24. So they both have 3 high value exchange connections. But because of the overall properties of the network, on the left, there's low value exchanges of 8 existing in the network between the B positions, whereas in the triangle on the right, the C's can trade with each other, any other C in the triangle, for 24 points. So even though both middle triangle on the left and middle triangle on the right had the same number of connections, and those connections were considered to be of the same value, A still had more power. They were able to get others to agree to exchange terms they wanted more than the person in the middle of the triangle labeled C. And that was due to the overall structure of the network, not just the connections that individual had. So the use of power by the individual in position A did not reach an equilibrium. So that is, the use of power never reached a point at which the power disadvantaged partner could obtain equal rewards from the alternative partner. It was set up in such a way that A could just continue to increase their negotiation stance, and there really was nothing structurally that the people positioned in point B could do about it, because their alternative partners could never offer the same value exchange as A could, even when A is like being blatantly unfair in terms of the rate of exchange. Here's another thing. Women in this were just as likely to use power as men when its consequences were not evident. So whenever the consequence of the exchange was not evident, we find that, possession of this identity, female or male, didn't have an effect for women. However, when the effect of the exchange was made evident, women were less likely to use power than men. This is reflecting the idea of gender norms. Men and women tend to view part of the behavioral expectation of women is to be caring, and so women were less likely to exercise power in these exchange networks when they understood what the consequences would be for the other people in the network. So what this says is exchange theory doesn't deny that other factors of the individual or the groups that they're nested within has an effect on interaction. What it's saying is that independent of that, the nature of the connections themselves and the configuration of those connections has an effect above and beyond anything else we've already talked about through things like status characteristics theory or symbolic interactionism or social structure and personality. Another point of interest is that women were more likely to exhibit this concept in social exchange theory called commitment. That is, they were more likely to engage in long-term exchanges with a partner, even when there's no advantage of doing so. So again, we're not saying that in actual interaction that behavior is perfectly determined by the properties of the network. What we're saying is that even after accounting for other factors, we still do find this pattern, though, of the overall structure of connections mattering. So how do people increase their power in exchange networks? Or sorry, in negotiate exchanges? One of the best ways to go ahead and increase your power if you're low power in a social exchange theory framework is to expand the network. So network expansion is one of the main mechanisms for increasing one's structurally based power at work or in other negotiations. And again, here we mean structurally in terms of the structure of connections rather than, say, the structure of society spanning meanings and expectations, right? Structure is this fun thing to where each phase within social psychology has its own sort of like emphasis on this is what structure is. Continuing on. So network expansion is one of the main mechanisms for increasing structural power within a network. By expanding your network, you get more exchange alternatives, which means you're less dependent on another actor for a reward. If I have alternatives to trade with, I now don't have to take this. I'm not as compelled to take the same shit deal as I would. At a certain point, I can then reject the increasingly unfair deal with an exchange partner and go with an alternative. And if I exchange my network, far enough, fast enough, well enough, strategically enough, I might rapidly find a new exchange partner um, who vastly blows out of the water not only the really unbalanced, unfair exchange I have with my original partner, but even the best deal my original partner could offer me might no longer be good enough. So we're going back to what I was talking about before. If you're like trying to buy something, you're likely to get a better deal when you buy a car if 4 instead of just 1 car dealer has the model you want. If I'm the only person within 100 miles that has the car you want, I can charge you more because I know you can't go down the street to my competitor who might say, "Yeah, we like to sell it for 100,000, but I lose out on $100,000 if you go to my competitor." So tell you what I'll do. I'll sell it to you for 95,000. I might lose $5,000 from my projected maximum I could get, which is I want to sell it for 100,000, but I'd rather have the 95,000 in my pocket and lose 5K than if you just flipped a coin and went to my competitor and paid 100,000 for his car and then I lose everything. Um, so yeah, that's what network expansion does. It prevents you from getting into a social network monopoly. I think I'm probably going to have to do a third short lesson to get the third part of this chapter done. There's just so much to talk about within the space of sociological social psychology. It's really hard not to just keep going on about it. I don't know. See how far we get in the next 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So we're talking about power in networks, the idea of expanding networks to change power imbalances within a network or upset a power balance in a network. If you're in a balanced power network, you can't really win out. You can't charge someone in exchange more than what is the fair exchange rate, because they'll just refuse to trade with you, and then you're both shit out of luck. But if you expand your network and find a new alternative partner, now suddenly you can demand more from your original partner if they want to keep you in the exchange. So, what are reciprocal exchanges now in the context of all this? Reciprocal exchanges usually take place over a lengthy period of time during which an individual assumes that rewards will be returned in the future, but there's no guarantee that this will be the case. So, one of your most typical reciprocal relationships is a romantic relationship. To a degree, like family and friends are also reciprocal relationships. Like you give love to a family member or like a mother, a father, a son, or a daughter, but you don't have any guarantee they'll love you back. You might give your son $1,000, but there's no guarantee that whenever you're in a nursing home, he'll pay $1,000 for some sort of comfort for you, right? This is a lengthy period of time, though, to where it's assumed that there will be some degree of reciprocity, to where even though there's no formal exchange, because of our long-term connection, I will likely get a return on my investment. So research on reciprocal exchange in a laboratory has found the use of using the let me start over. Research on reciprocal exchange in a laboratory has focused on the use of rewards and punishments. In these studies, it's been found that reward power is used less frequently than it could be in reciprocal relationships, right? These relationships that take place over time. And this might be related to the difficulties in using structurally based power effectively when you are inherently, because you know it's a reciprocal relationship, you know that you're foregoing short-term rewards for long-term benefits. You know that it could really come back to bite you if you try and use reward power as much as possible, because of the nature of this is not going to be a short-term exchange. Like it's going to be a continual process of exchange over time with no guarantees that the exchange won't blow up in your face at some point. Now, it's also found that individuals are reluctant to use coercive power. They're reluctant to use punishment, primarily because they fear the loss of future reward, not punishment. So in reciprocal relationships, the reason why you typically don't punish the other member of the network is not because you fear them punishing you back in terms of they can do something, they can put upon you a condition that you find harmful. What you're afraid of is that you will not be able to continue trading with that person. And you're especially afraid of that if you feel like you have an investment in this exchange that is not fully paid back what you were hoping to get out of it, but still may in the future. Reciprocal relationships really do affect how power can be used because of the fact that it's taking place over a longer period of time. So in these situations, the use of coercive power is only used when the potential for rewards in an exchange is so low that it's of little consequence. If you get to a point in a reciprocal relationship where you believe that you're actually not going to get a reward out of this for whatever reason, then you go ahead and pull the trigger and use punishment to try and extract some level of reward. The argument being that there's nothing left to lose through using punishment to try and extract concessions, because you are already set to get no reward anyway, and you're not really afraid of the other person punishing you, because if they punish you, you could just walk away from the exchange. So power is used less in reciprocal relationships and exchanges than these more short-term negotiated exchanges. Whenever the relationships within a network are not established over a period of time and are not proven to both, have a likelihood of staying established, and basically, if a relationship hasn't been established for very long and you don't perceive that it will remain for very much longer, then your use of power in that relationship is going to be more likely. So this brings in the idea of trust, right? This idea of there's a longer time period in terms of how long this this exchange might be occurring and how long this relationship might exist. And so into this comes the concept of trust. So what is trust from a exchange theory perspective? Given their long-term nature, reciprocal exchanges yield higher levels of commitment, positive affect, and trust than negotiated exchanges. Affect is just emotion. Like, it took me forever until someone finally told me that. Whenever we say things like, I have positive affect towards you, what I'm basically saying is I have good feels towards you. I can't really articulate a specific emotional set. It's not like I'm super happy to see you. I might be super happy to see you, but it's just more that I have good association with you. I have good feels towards you, with that being composed of a variety of complex emotions and perspectives. So in reciprocal relationships, you have higher levels of commitment, higher levels of affect, and higher levels of trust. We've already talked about commitment. I've just told you what affect is, so let's talk about what trust is now. Trust exists when an actor believes another person will act in an exchange in your own interest. So your partner will act in you, the individual's interest. Why do they do this? They are perceived to have an incentive to do so. You believe that they think they will be rewarded for acting in good faith towards you, or because in your mind, you think that they care about your well being. So you trust another person in an interaction when you believe they will enter in an exchange in a way that is at least not unfavorable to you, either because they in some way have been structurally incentivized to not exchange with you at a bad rate, or because they genuinely care about you outside of just who you are as a node in this exchange relationship. So Cook et al. In their book in 2007, Cooperation Without Trust, argue that trust in relationships often perpetuates racism and hinders productive economic exchanges. So we can get into that also in a separate sort of sub lesson if anyone's really interested, but here's the main points to take away. Although trust enhances personal relationships, it's often detrimental in a broader social and economic context, right? Because we're in an exchange relationship, and I believe that you have an incentive to not bring to light the fact that we're exchanging at a higher rate because we're both white. I trust that you're not going to disrupt this arrangement, both because you're incentivized not to, because you receive a higher reward rate if we monopolize this exchange network, but also because I might perceive that, well, you might just care about me more because we have more in common. So though this trust in an exchange network can enhance a personal relationship, it can often be detrimental in societal context because it tends to reify existing inequalities. People who have powerful resources, when they engage in network exchanges, they're more likely to trust people who are similar to them for various reasons, and that causes them to monopolize an exchange network, often to the detriment of other actors within the overall network. So because of this, organizations and institutions, including the government, can be considered substitutes for trust relations insofar as they protect individuals from unethical and unfair treatment by others through rules and regulations. Again, there's not much more to get into here in this more general overview video. If you want to talk more about this study, let me know and I'll do a small video on it. And there's a set of findings I really want to get to. I really want to get to these, but like we've already. All right. I'm going to get through the last few slides here on social exchange theory, and then I'm just going to have to do a short video on social identity theory afterwards. So bear with me here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 more slides. All right. This is where this has a really interesting set of findings too. So I just want to make sure that we talk about this before we conclude. So let's talk about social exchange in intimate relations, right? Intimate relationships. What do we mean by that? It can be these very emotionally intensive, small group relations that can be like family, but often it's romantic relationships is what we're talking about when we mean intimate relationships and social exchange. So outside of the laboratory, one way that group processes and structure researchers have studied this idea of social exchange is by studying the balance of power in romantic relationships and its consequences. And here's why. Here's one of the reasons why it's most fascinating in terms of studying romance relations in the West and especially in the United States. The vast majority of relationships and the standard by what we consider as normal for a relationship and the legal framework that supports this exchange is dyadic. That is to say, there's supposed to be in the social construction, and under law, this is the relation that is supported through various legal mechanisms, one and only other one person that you exchange with in this romantic exchange relationship. There are some people who do not practice monogamy, but by and large, monogamy defines the vast majority of relationships, including how relationships are recognized under law. So why is this fascinating? That this is a situation in the social world where you're almost compelled to where if you want to engage in a romantic exchange, it's going to be dyadic, at least if it's over time. So why is this interesting? In a dyad, where it's you and one other partner exchanging, and you can only exchange in a normative situation with one other partner, at least at a time, equity reflects the balance of rewards between relationship partners. And it's easy to study equity whenever it is between two people in one relationship and how the equity of that relationship is shaped by one of those two people deciding to end that exchange and pick up an exchange with someone else. So back to the equity, though. In a dyadic relationship, we often have equity, which is reflecting balance of rewards between partners. In an equitable relationship, each partner gives rewards proportional to those received. Idea being that it costs me something to give you love. Me feeling love might not cost me anything, but for you to receive that love, I have to do something to transfer it to you, even if it is just saying, I love you. That particular action over time will actually yield smaller results. Like you have to do a variety of things in order to take this resource which you may very well possess, which is love for the other person, and initiate a transfer to it to them so that that resource you possess is a reward to them. In an equitable relationship, we should be exchanging at a roughly 1-to-1 relationship. For every 1 unit of love I show you, I receive a unit of love. For each 1 unit of respect that my actions cause you to feel, I feel 1 unit of respect from you from the actions that you do in reference to me over time, right? Because um, this is a relationship network of two people rather than a negotiated exchange. It doesn't mean that, I got you flowers, so I'm expecting flowers immediately. And it doesn't mean we each associate getting flowers with 1 unit of love, however you would standardize love as a unit of measurement. It just means that over time, there's this equitable exchange. There's this relatively balanced rate of which we're receiving rewards from the other person. Now, that doesn't always happen in relationships. In inequitable relationships, one partner gives more and receives less than the other one. Even though you both might be in a romantic relationship, and even though you both may possess the same amount of love in your heart, one of you may end up showing it to the other person more than they show it to you. That is an inequitable relationship. It is an unequal exchange of reward. So, equitable relationships have been found to increase positive emotions and result in greater satisfaction and relationship stability. Inequitable relationships, negative emotion. What a surprise. If you feel as though over time you are receiving at least as much as you are given, that makes you feel good towards that person because they're not screwing you over. You have a relationship that you can start trusting, not worrying about. And because you're not worrying about it, it's more likely to remain stable. And you're more likely to take pains to ensure the stability of that exchange network. If you're in an inequitable relationship, you're more likely to feel bad once you recognize that, and therefore you're less likely to devote resources well, no, that's not necessarily true. Like in the most abstract, the idea would be you should be incentivized to contribute fewer resources because the relationship is inequitable. However, we know that it's not just this straightforward thought process, and oftentimes the person who is receiving less in a relationship will actually be more committed to maintaining that relationship. So let's talk about Sprecker's study of equity and emotion in dating relationships. So this slide and two others. If you're in a romantic relationship right now, by the way, and like, just be aware, this can cause you to seriously reflect on it. Like, whenever me and my cohort learned this in grad school, like, everyone left that class kind of really quiet that day because we were all reflecting on the power exchange in our own relationships. Because fundamentally, um, especially at a very young age, very few dating relationships, end up being equitable unless you're putting a lot of like intentional work into it and you have techniques to ensure the relationship is equitable. It's easy for it to fall into an inequitable relationship. And then reflecting on the fact that, oh shit, am I the person in the relationship with more or less power, can be really uncomfortable. So be aware that that's a thing. All right. So Spreaker's study of equity and emotion in dating relationships. In 1986, there was a study of 402 college students. All right. They were given a survey to measure the degree of equity in their romantic relationships. So they were asked to basically provide their perception as to what the exchange rate was in the romantic relationship in terms of, whatever you exchange in a romantic relationship, positive feeling, love, attention, whatever. In this study, in this survey, they also measured the frequency they felt various emotions, both negative and positive. So, what is the exchange rate in your relationship? What is the frequency that you feel good? What's the frequency you feel bad? We have three typologies that emerge from this study: over benefiting in inequity, equity, or under benefiting inequity. So if you're someone put into the over benefiting category, it means that in your relationship, and remember, we're talking about if you're one of these 402 students who provided this data, if you were over benefiting, it means you were getting more love than you were putting out. You were receiving more attention than you were giving. You were receiving more affection than you were given. You were given more respect than you were given. Whatever the rewards are in this exchange, you are receiving them at a higher rate than what you are returning to your partner by your own admission. Equity is whenever your data in the data you provide, it indicates that you perceive you're receiving relationship rewards from your partner as much as you are giving them to your partner. It's a very even ratio. If you're in the under benefiting category, that means you indicated in your study, in your survey data, that your partner was giving you fewer relationship rewards than you were giving to them over time. The rate was unequal against you. You were under benefiting for the amount of resources you were putting into the exchange. So surprise, surprise, students who were in that equitable category found the relationships more satisfying, or sorry, they just were more satisfied with their relationships, but they also experienced personal joy and then relationship joy and contentment more than if you were over benefiting or under benefiting. So think about that. If I'm in an exchange relationship, we're going to just simplify it again down to this idea of exchanging love. I'm happier in a relationship where I give 1 unit of love over time for every 1 unit of love I receive. I'm happier in that relationship as a statistic than if I were giving if I were given 1 unit of love for every 2 units I received. So if I'm receiving from my partner twice as much love as I'm showing them, I will feel worse than if it were a one-to-one exchange, even though I'm over benefiting. It's not surprising that if you're the one under benefiting that you're getting, if you're getting screwed over in the exchange rate, that you would feel worse than those in an actual equity-based relationship. But the real interesting finding is that if you're over benefiting, you also feel worse than if you were in that true equity relationship. Part of it, friends, is because whenever there's not equity in the exchange, you don't feel as much trust in the relationship because you have to assume that the other person knows that they are not getting a fair shake for the resources they're giving to you. And so now there's fear of the stability of the relationship. So even though you're getting more than you give out, you're still not as happy as if it were a true one-to-one exchange. So that's one reason why people feel a bit uncomfortable after this study. If it's like, ah, why don't I feel as good in this relationship as I would like to, even though my significant other showers me with affection all the time? Oh, it's because I'm not returning at a roughly equal parity. And so now I just don't have as much trust that the relationship and the exchange will continue because I recognize that it's not fair and I have to be concerned with the other person in this exchange eventually not being happy with it. Doesn't mean that if you're over benefiting, you're not happier than if you were under benefiting. But it's just to show that in an inequitable relationship, both parties are less happy than they would be if the relationship was equitable. Now, again, surprise, surprise, it's found that under benefiting in equity was more strongly associated with emotion than over benefiting in equity. So both are associated with not good feels to a degree, but you feel those emotions more intensely if you're the one who's getting screwed in the exchange rate. So if you under benefit, if you're giving your partner 2 units of love over time for every 1 unit of love you receive, you're going to experience high levels of anger, right? Although this will differ to a degree in terms of how this anger ends up manifesting over time. We find in other social psychology studies this idea that men and women deal with emotion differently because of socialized norms. Men tend to externalize, women tend to internalize, is the quick and dirty summary. And so men who under benefit in their romantic dyadic relationship had their anger translate into hate and resentment as emotions, these externalizations of emotion to where you have a target for your anger and that target is outside of yourself. You hate and resent outside, and it's normally directed at your partner because they're the one in the exchange relationship and you're perceiving them as not giving you a fair exchange deal. Women also experienced anger when they were under benefiting. If they perceived they were putting more into the relationship than they were getting, but they also experienced sadness and depression. Their anger, whenever it was focused on a target, partially got targeted towards themselves. They were feeling sad and depressed because they're in this shitty situation. Right? Both men and women experience higher levels of anger, but the associated emotions show how this anger becomes internalized or externalized, which is a whole nother facet of social psychology, largely nested kind of within social structure and personality, but kind of also touching symbolic interactionism. Okay, so continuing on though, that was under benefiting. If you're the one getting screwed in the exchange relationship, over benefiting, you still kind of feel anger. You still have a higher expression of anger. I personally suspect it's because you're over benefiting in a system of two that has an under benefiting member of that exchange, which causes them to introduce anger just into the system, which you respond to in anger. So both parties in an inequitable relationship are angrier than what their similarly situated like counterparts in an equitable relationship are. Again, though, unsurprisingly, there are some differences between genders in terms of what this experience of anger and this over benefiting translates into in terms of other emotions and behaviors and perceptions. Men, when they're over benefiting, tend to feel guilty, higher levels of guilt than if they were in an equitable relationship. This is not true for the females in the study. They did not experience higher levels of guilt if they were the over benefiting member in the exchange. This is consistent with gender differences in resources. Because of what they're over receiving is partially what causes this difference in guilt. Over benefiting women may be getting tangible resources such as material goods. Over benefiting men may be receiving more intangible resources such as love. This is something that it's an empirical finding that there's differences in the tangible resources exchanged. And so it then theoretically extends the logic to the difference in guilt is quite possibly due to the different types of resources involved in the exchange. Because while I've been saying love this entire time, like a unit of love, that's like I'm basically using that as a latent concept. Like within this idea of love, you could have positive expressions of emotion, but love can also be, buying someone a gift, right? So I don't want to imply that whenever I'm saying love, I'm just talking about the emotional concept. I'm being not necessarily lazy, but I'm being broad in my use of the concept. All right, friends. Here's our last slide, and this is the one that like I took away from my graduate training in group process. No, this was actually introduced in a different one. It was introduced in my coursework on the self, and just it really messed with us all as we were leaving. So be aware, like this is not absolutely deterministic, but it's hard not to look at your own relationship through this lens once you're made aware of it as an empirical sort of finding, right? Within this research on romantic relationships, not necessarily within the previously mentioned study, although partially in regards to that previous study, we have this concept known as the principle of least interest. So this partially determines this helps lead to inequity in relationships. Okay. In an exchange where you're only supposed to socially have a, a single other exchange partner. If you want to get a different exchange partner, you have to forego exchanging with your current partner. If you want someone else to give you romantic love, then you're not supposed to be continuing to exchange with your current partner. You're supposed to break up with them. You're supposed to get a divorce, right? That's why we have this sanctioning for cheating in a relationship. You're going outside of the prescribed standard of this exchange, which is there's only supposed to be one exchange partner over time in a long sense of time. No, sorry, I take that back. In a short sense of time, like you might have different partners over a long time, but you're not supposed to go partner one and then within the same day receive that same kind of romantic resource from partner two. So with all that framing it, what is the principle of least interest? Principle of least interest stipulates that individuals who are less emotionally involved in their romantic relationship, the over benefiting, whenever you're the over benefiting partner, you're less emotionally involved. You perceive yourself and your partner perceives you as having greater control over whether the exchange continues. The idea, and this is kind of how it plays out. The person who wants it, if you and your partner both don't want this relationship at the same sort of level of desire, the person who wants it less has more power in negotiated exchanges within that relationship. So if, like, this was my relationship at the time, I wanted that relationship, that specific exchange with that person more than she wanted the exchange to continue with me. In that case, whenever it came to actual exchanges while my and her relationship continued, she could and would invest less and less romantic exchange with me because she knew that she wanted this exchange less, knew I wanted it more, and so knew I would pay a premium in the exchange rate in order to keep the relationship going. This is the principle of least interest. The person with the greater ability to reward or punish another has the least to lose should the relationship end. If I have the ability to punish or reward you more than you do me, I have more power in setting the exchange rate. But in this romantic relationship, it's how much do I want love from you? And how much do you want love from me? And if I think that you want it more and I want it less, and I recognize that, and I recognize that you recognize that, I know that I don't have to put as much into the relationship for it to continue because you want it more. So you will pick up the slack. You will invest more into it to keep me at the table. Very uncomfortable to realize that if you feel as though you're giving more in a relationship than your partner is, you have to really ask yourself who wants it more. And if you're the one investing more in the relationship, odds are, even though you're giving more resources than your partner in terms of, this ratio, you probably still want it more. Even though they are receiving a greater level of reward than you are, they want it less. And it's because they want it less that they're able to extract more concessions out of you. This makes it sound very intentional and manipulative, and most of the time it is not so intentional. But it's just important to recognize that in this dyadic sense, if you're the one who is getting the rough end of the deal in terms of the exchange, you're probably the person who wants the exchange more. And you're probably the person who's going to pay a premium to keep the exchange going. That can be very uncomfortable to sit on, but it's important to, because it highlights the idea of negotiated power in interactions, with the actual exchange itself having properties that impact how you think and how you behave. Remember, this is not absolutely deterministic. This is probabilistic, but it's a very robust set of findings. All right, like I said, I want to say I have 4 slides left to go, but we see how I can just keep going on. So I want to make sure I give social identity theory proper time of day. So we're going to stop here. Thank you all for listening a bit longer than what I intended this to go for. I hope you found something in it interesting. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your time.